Hello and welcome to Straight Talk, Supply Chain Insights, the podcast for your supply chain leader who is on the go and wants to be in the know. And now, your host, Lora Cecere.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. My name is Lora Cecere, and this podcast is designed for the supply chain leader who's on the go but wants to be in the know. I'm Lora Cecere, and I'm like you. I spend a lot of time on airplanes, a lot of time talking to supply chain leaders. And today I want to talk about the efficient supply chain may not be the most effective. We come from a long legacy of supply chain thinking. 1982 and beyond is the time which we have been really thinking about how do we define supply chain excellence to deliver business excellence. And it's happened through dogged work of first and second and now third generation supply chain pioneers. The early days of supply chain were all about functional regional excellence. We grew up focused on return on assets, operational efficiency, managing local optimi. And as we've become more global and supply chains have become more complex, traditional supply chain that's more functional, linear, transactional, inside out, very focused on the four walls of the enterprise, is shifting to be more cross-functional, non-linear, and focusing on not just transactional data, but the use of different forms of data that moves at different speeds to allow us to sense changes, to learn. That thought of a learning organization is one that I'm really thinking about, and then to drive action that's coordinated and aligned and outside in. Whether it's the financial markets or what's happening with, the epidemic on, the virus situation, we certainly are living in a world where we're writing new case studies. When we look back at 2007, 2008 with the downturn in the recession, it took the average supply chain 6 months to sense market changes and then to correct. And the reason is because bad news does not travel well through a company. Good news travels really fast. Sales finishes a deal, high five, we get t-shirts, marketing has a new campaign, great advertising, it sweeps across the organization like wildfire. But a downturn in the market where fundamentally baseline lift goes down is hard for an organization because it's bad news and there is just this resiliency for the organization to sense, learn, and act. Instead, the functional silos will dig in. Sales will say, well, it's short term and we'll do this new program. Or marketing will say, we will do this new promotion or this new price. But, in a market, you've got, the ability of consumers to buy based upon what's happening in the market. And that's called baseline lift. And most companies can't measure baseline lift. And they can't have a data-driven discussion across the organization about what's happening in the market. And I call this market sensing, the ability to orchestrate the signals of demand through a river, because the river demand runs through the supply chain. We've been so focused on supply to be able to look at what is being bought, consumption data in all forms across all industries, and what can I supply? And then how do I orchestrate bidirectionally market to market, which looks at alternate bills of material, alternate sourcing, alternate sources of manufacturing. Perhaps I change modes of distribution. This bidirectional orchestration market to market, which is incumbent on the concept of sense, learn, and act, is a whole new set of behaviors that's enabled by new forms of analytics. So I was speaking at a conference last week. It's Foundation for Strategic Sourcing. And when I was asked to speak, the organizer said, Lora, we would like you to come and speak on the efficient supply chain. And I put the phone on mute and I groaned because Traditionally, we have believed that the efficient supply chain is the most effective. But we don't have one supply chain, we have multiple supply chains. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we type supply chains. And because we've been so supply-centric, we've been looking at volume-based analysis, simple ABC analysis, not really thinking about the impact of variability. So when we add an analysis of coefficient of variation, which looks at how forecastable is this data, what is the pattern of demand, then we find that we need an efficient supply chain, which is the highest volume and very predictable products, and those particular items can be managed at the lowest cost in a very transactional environment, very focused on tight integration. And that's what we've built over the last 3 decades. The problem is that our growth strategies are pulling us to products that are lower volume with higher demand variability, and we're not measuring demand variability. And as we move into the design of supply chains for those patterns, we have to be more responsive, shorter cycles, for the supply chains for e-commerce and also pharmaceuticals and highly seasonal products. And these products have very high demand, but they require a short response. An efficient supply chain at the lowest cost per unit will never enable success in the supply chains that need a responsive and dramatic pull of product based upon the market. So the responsive supply chain is the shortest cycle, and it's being able to adapt the cycles of the supply chain to what's happening in the market. An agile supply chain is different than a responsive supply chain, and that an agile supply chain allows us to have the same cost, service, and quality given the level of demand and supply volatility. So let's look now at supply volatility. Wow. I mean, we're going to be living a nightmare for the next 2 quarters where things are not going to show up at factories, whether it's titanium-based paints or products that require titanium or single-sourced ingredients that have suppliers in Asia. We're going to find that we have a lot of variability. And the agile supply chain allows me to respond to variation, whether it's variation, and oh, by the way, I need to measure it in demand. And my favorite tactic is coefficient of variation. I wrote a blog post recently of Get Your COV on, which looks at measuring items and the variability of items and designing supply chains based upon variability. And when you've got intermittent demand, we really need an agile supply chain, which is a coefficient of variation of 0.3, and some might say 0.5, but it's 0.3 to 1.0 is how I measure it, which looks at intermittent demand and an agile supply chain. So efficient is high volume, very predictable. Let's manage lowest cost. That's the supply chain we understand. That's the supply chain we've inherited. A responsive supply chain is a shorter cycle needed for pharmaceuticals. We know people are going to get sick. We just don't know the timing. Or bathing suits or suntan lotion or e-commerce. An agile supply chain is really designed for supply chains where we have high demand and supply variability. These are 3 very different designs. And so the efficient supply chain may not be the most effective supply chain. And as a result, we are not able to drive balance sheet performance. And the functions fight each other. They're not aligned. The efficient supply chain can enable the growth initiatives. So I say, okay, let's just stop all this, right? Let's stop the craziness. Let's look at what do we need that's fit for function? What do we need for the growth strategies? I got an email from a financial analyst that I'll just read a part of it. And she's talking about the lack of growth strategies. And she basically hosts a conference for financial analysts following the food and beverage, consumer packaged goods companies. And her email says that She thinks one of the biggest problems is that U.S.-centric food companies, Kellogg, General Mills, Smucker, ConAgra, she lists, are working on if you have a hammer, all you see is a nails problem. So these financial analysts are frustrated because company after company have been talking to them about technology strategies of enterprise resource planning, ERP, APS, tightly integrated supply chain, and they're not making progress. She says, we've been making box, can, and otherwise shelf-stable packaged goods for well over a century, but consumers and retailers are looking for fresh foods and they don't know how to adapt. These companies don't know what to do. And she says Campbell's foray into sea business was disastrous. So because this fresh foods, this new growth strategy for e-commerce is all about short cycles in the agile supply chain, the companies that are running these highly efficient, high volume supply chains cannot be successful. And she goes on, with the rise of channels, particularly e-commerce, companies are not playing effectively. Meanwhile, retailers are getting more sophisticated in analytical capabilities. They have greater capabilities to manufacture products. And it's destroying the role of category captain for large consumer packaged goods companies. And she says, I don't understand. Everything's getting faster. New products are introduced and eliminated, and better analytics should enable real-time feedback. But I don't see companies adapting. Companies are blind to these insights. And, I love this email, and I'm going to be talking to a group of financial analysts in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to talk about today's supply chain's drowning in data and we can't get to insights. And one of the issues is us. It's because we've spent 1.7% of revenue on information technology that's really all about transactions and understanding history. It's not about reading markets, translating market demand, looking at bidirectional demand, and all of the industries are under pressure. We're not driving the results at the balance sheet that we need. So let's just take a breath, right? I have a company that I work with in Europe and a person I respect a lot who says to me, well, Lora, it is all about the balance in the triangle between customer service, inventory, and cost. And I'm like, yeah, I don't think so. I think that is an old-fashioned thought, right? I think that it has an awful lot to do with design and the role of asset strategies. So I'm a chemical engineer. I wouldn't have gotten out of college if I couldn't design heat exchangers and distillation columns, and that's passé, but it gave me the belief in design. Today only 10% of companies actively design their supply chains. And one of the missing links is the asset strategy for supply chains that need to be agile and responsive. So in a traditional manufacturing environment, and I love these manufacturing team leaders, they've led these organizations for many years. I've got bunions on my feet for my safety shoes. I grew up in manufacturing. I get it. But the manufacturing concepts around supply chain effectiveness are dead weights to be able to drive the agile and responsive supply chain. It's like a dinosaur that we need to really put to rest. The balance of a simple triangle of customer service, inventory, and cost misses the role of assets and the need for an asset strategy that aligns with demand and supply variability. So let me give you an example. I'm working with a company that has a wonderful product. It's definitely in a growth strategy. Consumers love it, growing category. It's got a very loyal baseline lift, but they short 1 out of 2 orders. And they short the orders on the long tail, which are primarily, whether they're samples or special diets, they're shorting the long tail items. And deductions, the charges by the retailers, are forecasted to be $9 million this year. And because it's a regional supply chain and a global organization, the finance team says, just put that deduction charge into promotions. And so it's hidden on the balance sheet. And what that does is it stops the ability of this particular region to really control their own destiny and to use that money for true promotions to increase market share. So the company doesn't measure order and reason codes of why orders are shorted. So imagine you've got this strategic team that's staying up all night, worried about why orders are shorted and why retailers don't like them. But at a local level, we are not measuring why orders are shorted. And it's taken me 6 months, and I gave them a technology to use and set up a free trial with a pretty advanced technology company. But it's taken me 6 months to get this team to cross-functionally measure why our orders shorted and to go through the 5 why strategy of why are orders shorted and what was the root cause, and the 5 whys, to be able to get to the reason. They've got an email and Agile environment, and they're very stuck in functional measurement. So when we looked at the initial order short data, we found that 41% was due to quality issues and 45% was due to the lack of schedule adherence by manufacturing. So let me come back to my argument that I'm having with this European consultant, that supply chains are simply about the trade-offs of customer service, inventory, and cost. Here, this particular organization is 95% utilized. Intermittent demand has grown. They don't measure intermittent demand. They don't look at, do they have a feasible plan, because it takes more asset capacity for a variable supply chain than a predictable supply chain, and they lack the ability to drive first pass yield and schedule adherence. But they feel really good because they're high on return on assets and they're doing a great job on OEE. So you might say, well, how can a company do a great job on OEE, which is really an efficiency measurement of, am I getting the most output out of the factory, versus schedule adherence? Well, it's a different mindset, right? Schedule adherence and first pass yield are all about designing the factory for reliability and aligning that reliability signal to the type of supply chain, whether it's efficient, agile, or responsive. But if I'm measuring only return on assets and I'm measuring OEE, I throw the supply chain out of balance, which is the case here, and I'm unable to manage the long tail of the supply chain, which is so essential for this particular company's growth strategy. So we mapped the river of demand, and we found out a lot of interesting things about the river of demand. It's a wonderful exercise for everyone to do, is to map what data is available, how that data is used, how data goes through the organization, what's happening in the river of demand as it goes across the supply chain. Demand should never be seen as a time phase forecast of, demand planning output. It's the ability to manage the demand signal. And in that management of the demand signal, we have to hold ourselves accountable for forecast value add and if we're making that signal better. So in this river of demand, I had 5% of cases that were unforecasted. And the reason these cases were unforecasted were they were special one-offs that marketing was doing that didn't go through the traditional sales and operations planning processes, and they kind of showed up. There were also regional supply chain influences because they supplied product for other regions within the company, and those demand signals were really bad, and there was an agreement that they would prioritize the regional demand coming in over the market demand, which was always throwing the supply chain out of balance because of the lack of cycle stock management. And so when we looked at just baseline, was the company driving a better signal out of demand planning than the naive forecast, which is a technique called forecast value add. And I hope everyone is looking at forecast value add, which says how effective is that demand plan in improving the demand signal over a naive signal, which is 3 months rolling average. And we found that they were really enmeshed in this huge fight about technology A versus technology B. But when we looked at the ability for this company to have a better signal coming out of the demand planning tool, they were degrading the demand signal by 22%. So here's this company with very high asset utilization. The strategic team and corporate is really worried about order shorts. They're not measuring order shorts. They got a very manufacturing-centric organization that's marching down the street of an efficient supply chain. And what is happening is they're throwing the supply chain out of balance, and they're compounding it by giving the supply chain a bad signal. And they're fighting about which technology versus saying, what is possible in improving the demand signal? What are the elements of the river demand, and how do I drive an improvement? So what we found out was 83% of the volume was very forecastable, but 5% of the volume was intermittent demand and required an agile supply chain. 11% of the volume was new product launch, really tied to growth strategies and required a responsive supply chain, very focused on cycles, and that was very closely tied with e-commerce. And less than 1% of the items were not forecastable and needed to be really managed in a make-to-order supply chain. Okay, so I have 4 supply chain types here. I have a make-to-stock supply chain. I have the need for an agile supply chain for intermittent demand. I have the need for a new product launch supply chain, and I have a need for a make-to-order supply chain. So what I advocated was that they put in process a simple way of looking at coefficient of variation, typing supply chains, and applying tactics. So in the make-to-stock environment, where they knew what the demand was and they could predict the demand, I recommended that they try to find outsourced contract manufacturing for that product. Whoa, says manufacturing, you can't do that. I want to outsource the intermittent demand, the stuff that's hard to predict, because if I'm having to run all those cats and dogs, I'm going to destroy my return on assets and my OEE. I'm not designed to make intermittent demand. Okay, here's the problem. When I outsource intermittent demand items and I increase the latency of the signal and the translation of what's needed to contract manufacturing, I create a very wasteful supply chain. And in fact, because today we connect contract manufacturers through Excel spreadsheets, portals, and EDI, all of which are ineffective to connect and synchronize the supply chain, I amplify the bullwhip and I make a lot of product I don't need. I'm out of sync with the market. So I had a fight on my hands. I said, you do not have enough capacity. You need to focus manufacturing on reliability, first pass yield, and schedule adherence, and you need to outsource to give yourself some buffer and asset capacity with the predictable items, and you need to design agile work centers for your new product launch and your make-to-order products, and those agile work centers are not going to be at the same efficiency or return on assets because of demand variability, because it's just not feasible as your current assets. So let's start by mapping the river demand. Let's start by designing the supply chain. Let's understand forecastability. Let's look what's possible, and let's hold ourselves accountable for order management. Well, in this organization, I'm known as the provocateur. I won't be back to that organization for 3 to 6 months because they're in a tailspin. I have challenged all of the functional constants in the organization, and they're not sure what to do. So at this conference that I spoke at, which is Foundation for Strategic Sourcing, as I told that story, I looked out in the audience, and I could have been at that client, right? I have all of these companies that come from food and beverage and packaged foods, consumer packaged goods, and cosmetic companies that have built really efficient supply chains that are making the wrong stuff. And they feel very good because they have great OEE and high asset utilization, but they're shorting the long tail of the supply chain, and they don't feel the pain of fixing it. So Then I started to talk about the digital supply chain, where we can transform the atoms and electrons of the supply chain by looking at new technologies. Could we 3D print products, right? So L'Oreal is doing some 3D printing of lipstick tubes. I have some companies that are working on samples, through 3D printing. Could we 3D print packaging? Can we use streaming data? The Internet of Things signal through manufacturing of all the PLCs and pump motors to be able to look at uptime, to be able to look at the signals of transportation providers, of GPS and telematics, to be able to get better on-time delivery. Can we use cognitive computing, rules-based ontologies to sense, learn, and act, and build semantic reasoning layers off of open source analytics, where we're looking at the world of parallel processing, Hadoop, Kafka, and schema on read. And I'm so excited about open source analytics because, one of our issues is we feel so good when we stuff data into rows and columns in a pristine form that we forget how to use it, and we don't capture all the unstructured data that can help us to really drive the organization forward. And can we automate the worker through wearables and mobility and robotics to be able to drive the supply chain forward? So perhaps the warehouse workers no longer fork trucks and HGVs, but instead as, really focused on, the robot bringing the stuff to the pick, enabling personalization with wearables so I know how to personalize that product, or it's automatically packaged for e-commerce. Fun happens when we start to design the supply chain for intermittent demand and responsive, and we look at what data needs to move through clouds for federation into the network, what data needs to move through streams, which is the streaming data, which, by the way, doesn't fit in traditional architectures, and which data needs to be in pools. And the pooling data is really about where I need to gather data for historic analysis to be able to tie data together. And so I said to companies in the room, go home, map your river of demand, look at your coefficient of variation, hold yourself accountable for forecast value add, type your supply chains. Then for every supply chain, look at where you had gaps in the last year. Where did you falter? Where did you have order shortages? Where were you not able to deliver on the business results? And then look at the data that you have that might be able to help you to drive better answers. So I talked about a company that was a distributor in the Midwest, and they really wanted to be the number one distributor of their products. And they did an annual survey and they did a net promoter score, but that wasn't effective. So I said to them, could we mine your email data? They got 12,000 emails a month from their customers, to look at sentiment, to look at patterns, to look at how people are feeling by type of customer. And could you use that to push a semantic reasoning layer with RPA to better serve customer service agents? They had automated a lot of the supply chain with, traditional CRM, and I was arguing that that wasn't sufficient. So supply chains don't play by the rules, right? They're not going to be efficient. Even though we have efficient factories, we need to be able to use data better. We need to be able to design the supply chain for variability and really think about building networks. And so I asked the group to think about networks. What is a network? A network is not one-to-one. It's not well served by EDI strategies or portals. Portals are like dead pools. They're like dead-end streets. They don't serve anybody other than people just having a false sense they're doing something good. EDI is like the mail. I get a letter in my mailbox, and typically the information's 2 to 3 days old, and I open it and it's not bidirectional, and it costs a lot of money to move that mail into my mailbox. EDI is very similar. So when we think about networks, we need to think about master data and interoperability, not just integration. Interoperability allows me to have authoritative identifiers to know who companies are, which we find that about 40% of the companies on the item master and on the supplier master are duplicate or erroneous. And so it's hard to, do business where I've got that level of duplication. And so I encourage people to map to the ISO 8000 standard of ALEI for companies and SFX for items, and to own their authoritative identifiers. But also I encourage this group to build a canonical that could be adopted by the existing supply chain operating networks. And the supply chain operating networks are companies like Limica and Eda Open and SupplyOn that could help people to understand what is required in the management of contract manufacturing in an ideal state of how do we think not just about single ifs to single thens, but how do we bring a semantic reasoning layer in a canonical and multiple ifs to multiple thens to allow the network to sense, learn, and act, and work with the existing supply chain operating networks to be able to do this. So when I looked out in the audience, I saw a lot of salespeople from a lot of packaging companies, and I saw a lot of people that were directors and senior managers from procurement and manufacturing. And I thought, this is a stretch for them. But I'm hoping that somewhere somebody can think that it isn't about tight integration. It's about data portability and synchronization and network bidirectional flows and orchestration, and that it's about reliability and functions and alliance and alignment to balance sheets. And it's about owning our master data and to learn from the past, unlearn, to rethink, because we have built efficient supply chains that are making the wrong product. This is Lora. Thank you for joining me with Straight Talk with Supply Chain Insights. Until next time.